Hi, we're here at the Earth at Risk Symposium in San Francisco. It's a two-day event, numerous speakers talking about the crisis that the planet and our species faces. I'm sitting here with Richard Manning, who's done a lot of work in the last 10 or 15 years focusing on the environment and agriculture and how that's affected us as a species, and has a lot of really interesting thoughts. This event has one goal, and that goal is to craft a game-changing response to address the converging crises we all face. So, Richard, I want to ask you what, in your eyes, are the crises, and what do you think the responses should look like, and what is your personal role in addressing these crises?
Well, 10 years ago, when we talk about what the crisis looked like, we'd have to define that and explain it to people. And I think that's no longer true. I think people really understand what the problems are. And they'll say things like global warming, crash of biodiversity, species decline, those issues. Those are really all tentacles on the same problem. And the core of that is industrial society, the way we live, and it's causing the life on the planet to collapse, and that's abundantly clear now. A response to that is, in some ways, unwinding that system, and the impulse is to say, well, what do I do as an individual to bring that about almost immediately? And I think that's in some ways a dangerous impulse. In other words, we think that we're smart enough to change things all on our own and go out and design a new system from scratch. It's not going to work that way. It's much more complex. The problems themselves are complex. They emerged over 10,000 years. They really have been coming for that long. And so we need to have a little bit of humility in designing those solutions and where we go from here. And I think that sometimes that humility is lacking, in activists especially. I was going to say I don't like activists. I think that's a pretty good idea. We need to be activists now, but we need to temper that. And I think it begins always by understanding your own situation, your own life, and making that better in some way, making that sustainable. I don't just mean shop at organic groceries. I mean consider your health, your connections to the biota, your connections to biodiversity, and maximize those connections in some way so you know what you're talking about, so you have real experience with nature. There's a movement in Europe called rewilding, that people want to rewild the landscape as much as possible. I think we have to rewild ourselves, our own bodies, and that's really where this begins.
Okay, so again, we know that we have these converging crises. How serious do you think the threats are? How immediate should the action be? And what is an action plan for the people at this point in time? What do we need to help reverse this horrible, devastating trend? I mean, what does an uprising look like? What is it going to take for us to reverse the course of, our impending doom?
One of the things we need to realize is it's not going to be reversed. That the issues the problems are now so firmly entrenched and set in motion, and the decline is happening and has been happening really for 30 years in big ways. And so that decline is going to continue. It's not going to get much better anytime soon. But also at the same time, and coincident with that, is we can evolve solutions, and we need to see what those look like. So I always tell people, look for something that's working. Begin there. Begin there. Something in your community that you understand that works in your situation, it works in your environment, and make it work better in some ways. And that sounds like a fairly modest role, but in fact you can engage an entire lifetime in that activity, and that's what you need to do. The top-down solutions, even well-meaning top-down solutions, tend not to work. And in fact, we have a history of this, of well-meaning people causing a whole lot of problems. The Green Revolution, for instance, what we argue about here today, of causing a huge number of problems. It began with very progressive people who wanted to stop poverty in some ways. And their idea of a solution then was narrow-minded, as ours will be today. So we have to have some humility in approaching that.
Right. So it sounds as though, and I think there is a common thread in today's conference about the situation is basically so dire that there's, small actions here and there just aren't enough at this point in time to again reverse the damage that's been done. So it does seem as though that everybody really needs to be responsible in one way or another of doing something different that again gets us moving in a different direction. So do we need a big wake-up call for Americans? And if we do need a big wake-up call, what does that wake-up call look like? Because it seems as though at this point in time, no one's really listening, and people don't really seem to get how serious the situation is. So, again, I guess, how do we get people to pay attention and to start making different daily decisions in their lives?
I think if we needed a wake-up call, we've had a pretty good one lately in the United States with our recent elections. I mean, if we never need a better indicator of how far gone we are, we have a completely corrupt system. And we made that abundantly clear. And in the face of the problems that we're dealing with now, all our response is to ramp up more racism, more separation in our country, more oppression of minorities, and inequality. Those things are going on. So we need to back up and say, wait a minute, we can blame the plutocrats for that. We can blame the people in power and say, well, they're doing this to us, but they won that war with propaganda in some ways. And we should be immune to that. We should be smart enough to see through that propaganda. And the fact that we're not said, we got a lot of work to do.
I've heard that, that our government is very much aware of this kind of impending collapse. So the governments of the world are aware of it. And they feel potentially as though, again, the situation is so dire that nothing can be really done to reverse it. And so what it seems as though they may be doing is just pretending that there's not really a problem. Can you speak about that and in any way, shape, or form kind of enlighten us on what you believe the governments of the world believe is happening, and if they feel like they can do anything to reverse it, or they're just going to let us slide into darkness?
Well, governments aren't monoliths. There are portions of our government that are completely aware of the problems. They've been in all the official reports. I mean, we just have to look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and what they're telling us, and it's true, and it's dire.
Yep.
It's deeply dire.
Yep.
Our own government also tells us the social problems, like inequality. We know those numbers from the government. There are forces within government that are trying to deal with that in some ways, but they're constrained by opposing powers. And so it's not like we have to give up on government completely, although I'm kind of of that opinion lately, and I can see how people could be. But on the other hand, we have to see what's working and say, well, how do we make it work better, again, within government.
Right. Okay, one more question. So, given the fact that the governments don't seem to really be doing much to, again, reverse this horrible trend, is it up to the people? Is that the only way we can see real change, is through individuals making different decisions in their lives? Because it seems as though with a corrupted political system, and no movement there, it does seem like it's going to be up to the people. Do you agree with that statement, and could you shed a little light on that?
I agree with both sides of that. That first of all, it is up to the people. There's one of my favorite stories has to do with Gandhi, who was one time leading a movement in India, as everybody knows, and some reporters stopped him and said they had to question him, and as a demonstration was going by, and he said, well, there go my people, I'm their leader, I must follow them. And that's exactly true. If we're able to create the kind of groundswell force for some of these solutions, then the leadership has no choice but to follow in some ways. And that's happened in a lot of areas, like wind energy. If we look at that, for instance, that's happened from the ground up, with some assistance from government. So it's like you have to enable leaders to lead, and that's to create the path of least resistance. And so we have to create the solutions on the ground that are viable and that are sustainable, and then bring the leadership along on those in some ways.
Derek Jensen, who is moderator at the conference here today, suggests he has a phrase or a thought that at what point in time will you stand up and fight back? When 90% of all the fish in the oceans are dead, or is it 91% of when at what point in time will individuals stand up and fight back? I believe that we all at this point in time should be standing up and fighting back. Although it's fighting back against a very violent system seems challenging at best. How do we get our message across without violence in a peaceful way that could be effective moving forward?
You know, I have to admit, I'm a little mystified by the same thing right now. The same issue is I don't understand why people aren't in the streets more than they are. And I came of age, I'm old enough to have come of age in the Vietnam War. And I know what the anti-war movement looked like. I know the kind of commitment that it drove people to the streets, putting their lives on the line in many cases. And I know what universities looked like at the time. They were very different than we have today. That said, I look back at that time and I say, well, what were we fighting in those days? We were fighting for world peace and against oppressive wars. We were fighting for social justice. We were fighting for an end of racism. If I look at all those three issues, here we are, 2 generations later, worse off on every single one of those. And I said, well, is that my generation's fault? Did we do something wrong back then that caused those things to go off the rails? And at the same time, when you ask me about solutions, I say, okay, guys, what are you going to do? Because I'm watching now, but I almost feel like it's not my job to come up with a solution. We did that a generation ago. We screwed it up, and we're reticent to act, and so it's to younger people to do it now. We'll see what'll happen.
Yeah, so speaking of younger people, it seems as though our future, and we're putting obviously our grandchildren's or our children's lives at risk, I believe, but it really is up to the younger people, I believe, and a lot of our focus in our media endeavor is to try to get to the youth, to get them focused and motivated to start demanding real change. Do you agree with that?
To a degree, but the case I'm making is for larger responsibilities in this and individual responsibilities. The immediate impulse is to go to the streets or to do some sort of protest, and I understand that. I mean, I have the same impulses, but as you age, you understand, and as you look at nature and understand that there are diverse solutions out there, that things happen on an evolutionary scale, and we all have different roles. I'm a writer, so I think I can make more change by writing and making people understand issues or see issues or appreciate issues than being in the streets. And that's just what I happen to do. And we can imagine how that plays out for other roles as well. You know, a farmer has a role in this in real ways, because farmers can make decisions that influence the landscape. Certainly teachers have roles in this in the education system, and that's fundamental to all this. And so it's not enough to go to the streets. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm saying we need to exercise our roles in every single sphere. We need to take care of each other.
Yep.
One of the things that's really broken down is our ability to relate to other people and conduct relationships and be empathetic and compassionate as humans. When we lose that, we've lost everything. There's nothing we can do right. And so the first order of business is to take care of the people around you, always.
Yep.
Always, to relate to them, to see to their health, their well-being. And that enables them to be strong and be warriors in some ways at the same time. And so we can't really go into this unless we're looking after each other at the same time.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and I very much relate to that, and I think you're right on target with that. Well,
Good.
thank you very much for sitting down with us. I really appreciate it, and thanks for coming to the event.